Chapter 18, Brother, I'm Dying, by Edwige Danticat, titled, No Greater Shame. The next day, Friday, my father's health took a turn for the worse. Worried about my uncle, he hadn't slept the night before. His voice was so hoarse from coughing that he could barely speak when I called. His eczema and psoriasis had returned, and he completely lost what little appetite he had. My daughter had just begun to kick at night, and her fetal acrobatics left me totally exhausted in the morning. I was in bed fighting a fainting spell when Bob called to tell me about Papa. Maybe you should take him to the hospital, I told Bob. He doesn't want to go, Bob said. He says they'll just send him home like all the other times. As Bob spoke, I could hear my father coughing and moaning loudly in the background. He's getting worse, Bob added, and this thing with Uncle's not helping. I wanted very much to be in New York with my father, so I closed my eyes and imagined myself there. I'm sitting on the edge of his bed, and we're watching my father's favorite game show, The Price is Right, on television. Unsure of the answers, we guess wildly, but still get all of them right anyways. This makes my father so happy that he rises out of bed and starts to dance. At first he dances like a ballerina in slow motion, but then he increases his pace until he's jumping up and down, bouncing on and off his bed. When I woke up, I wasn't sure whether this was a reverie or a dream. However, when I looked at the digital clock on my bedside table, it was after 3 p.m. The phone was ringing, which is why I had woken up in the first place. I picked it up, expecting my uncle and Maxo. Instead, it was Tante Z. Are they with you? She asked. No, I said. Perhaps they'd called and I'd missed them. I looked for the flashing message button on the phone. The call log also registered no calls. Their plane should have landed by now, Tante Z said. They'd gone to the airport very early, but their plane had left sometime after noon. I took them to the airport myself. She was speaking loud and fast. There was an edginess to her voice, a strain of anxiety. I took them in a camionnette. I sent you tablets, she added, the kind I know you like. Uncle has them for you. That she remembered to send me some peanut confections at such a stressful time amazed me. I thought you might have some cravings, she said. Unsatisfied cravings can lead to birthmarks on the baby. She was quiet for a moment, then started again in the same quick and loud voice. Listen, take good care of your uncle, she said. He's lost everything. I'll take care of him, I said. I don't think he should come back to Haiti for a long time, she continued. It's crazy here now. No peace. I attributed the fact that I didn't hear from my uncle and Maxo to a plane delay. Then I called the airline, American Airlines, and found out that the plane my uncle and Maxo had meant to be on had left and landed. Because of privacy laws, they couldn't tell me whether my uncle and Maxo had been on it or not. As it got later and my husband returned from work, I grew increasingly nervous. Maybe they'd missed their plane altogether, my husband said, and were bumped to the next day. The early evening went by with no news. Then more calls, first from Uncle Frank in New York, then from my father. Worrying me even more, my uncle's pastor's friend called. His wife had waited 3 hours at Miami International Airport and had seen no sign of either my uncle or Maxo. Around 9 p.m., the calls suddenly stopped. Cell phones in tow, Fedo and I went for what we'd come to call our daily pregnancy walk on the boardwalk on Miami Beach. It was a balmy night, but a cool breeze was coming off the ocean. We didn't walk long. Worried that my uncle might remember only the house telephone number, we hurried home to wait by the phone. Intermittently, I called Tante Z on her cell phone, but I got no reply. Fedo and I lay down and tried to brainstorm some possibilities. I wanted to have at least one likely explanation for my father. They're probably coming tomorrow, I told my father when he called. My father had merely called to check on my uncle and Maxo. He was too weak to continue talking. I fell into a deep, sad sleep. My phone rang at 1:30 the next morning. Ever since my father had become ill, late night and early morning phone calls sent my now very large body leaping straight out of bed. Still, I missed the call. On the voicemail was a message from a female U.S. Customs and Border Protection officer. She could have read from a contact advisory of CBP detention form, which contains a script provided by Customs and Border Protection that would have had her say, I am Officer so-and-so of U.S. Customs and Border Protection at Miami International Airport. Your uncle, who has arrived in the United States on American Airlines Flight 822, has asked that we contact you. However, what he said instead was, Ms. Dantika, we have your uncle here. She then paused, and it sounded as though she moved her mouth slightly away from the phone to ask my uncle, What is your name, sir? My uncle's voice box came through clearly as he replied, Joseph Dantika. He pronounced his name in the French way, putting the most emphasis on the last syllable. Though an error in my father's birth certificate had made him a Dantika, giving us a singular variation of the family name, we still pronounced our surnames the same. In French and Creole, our T was silent, though I often joked with my uncle that in English we were cats, and he was not. We have him here, the female officer continued on the message, at U.S. Customs and Border Protection. He's requested asylum, and we're completing his paperwork. There was hope, kindness in her voice, a matter-of-fact impression of normalcy and routine. But her number had not registered on my phone, and she hadn't left it for me to call back. My husband searched the internet while I leafed through the yellow pages for a Customs and Border Protection listing at Miami International Airport. After a while, we got through. Someone just called me, I said, about an elderly man and his son. I'm familiar with them, the man who replied said. In his few words, I could hear the disdain, which perhaps was always in his voice, but seemed nevertheless particularly directed at me. They came here with no papers and tried to get in. They have papers, I tried to explain. I'm sorry, he said, but I have 2 flights coming in. Then he hung up. We have to go to the airport, I told my husband. We were only 15 minutes away, and they were not getting anywhere on the phone. At the closed American Airlines counter at the airport, we found a Haitian janitor who directed us to the entrance to the Customs and Border Protection offices. They too were closed. Standing outside the metal doors, I dialed the office's number again. Another male officer picked up. Someone called me, I said, about my uncle, Joseph Dantika. He should be with his son, Maxo. They're right here in front of me. This was the kindest and most polite-sounding voice yet. I'm in the airport, I said. Yes? I've come to pick them up. His long pause indicated some kind of misunderstanding on my part. Something had been said to me that I'd obviously not fully grasped. We only called to notify you that they're here, he said. They're not being released. They're going to Crome. My heart sank. The year before, I had been to the Crome Detention Center as part of a delegation of community observers organized by the Florida Immigrant Advocacy Center. A series of gray concrete buildings and trailers, Crome was out in what seemed like the middle of nowhere in southwest Miami. During our visit, a group of men in identical dark blue overalls had been escorted into a covered, chain-link fenced concrete patio rimmed by rows of barbed wire. The men walked in 2 straight lines, sat at the long cafeteria-style tables, and told our delegation their stories. They were Haitian boat people, and in addition to their names, identified themselves by the vessels on which they'd come. My name is, they said, I came on the July boat, or I came on the December boat. Some invented parables to explain their circumstances. One man spoke of mad dogs, gang members, threatening him and forcing him to seek shelter at a neighbor's house, the neighbor being the United States. Another sang about a mudslide, meaning the lavalas or flood party, which had washed everything away. Another asked us to tell the world that detainees were beaten sometimes. He told of a friend who had had his back broken by a guard who was deported before he could get medical detention. Some detainees fought among themselves, sometimes nearly killing each other as uninterested guards looked on. They spoke of other guards who told them they smelled, who taunted them while telling them that unlike the Cuban rafters, who were guaranteed refuge, they would never get asylum, that few Haitians ever get asylum. They said of the large rooms where they slept in rows and rows of bunks that were often so overcrowded that some of them had to sleep on thin mattresses on the floor. They were at times so cold that they shivered all night long. They told of the food that rather than nourish them, punished them, gave them diarrhea, and made them vomit. They told of arbitrary curfews, how they were woken up at 6 a.m. and forced to go back to that cold room by 6 p.m. I'd seen some of the men who looked too young to be the mandatory 18 years old for detention at Crome. A few of them look 14 or even 12. How can we be sure they're not younger? I asked one of the lawyers in our delegation. If they've come with no birth certificates, no papers. The lawyer answered that their ages were determined by examining their teeth. I couldn't escape this agonizing reminder of slavery auction blocks where mouths were pried open to determine worth and state of health. One man who had received asylum but who had not yet been released when we visited showed us burn marks over his arms, chest, and belly. His flesh was seared white with rows and rows of keloid scars. It seemed like such a violation to look at his belly, the space where the scars dipped farther down on his body. But he was used to showing his scars, he said. He had to show them to a number of immigration judges to prove he deserved to stay. I sat across from an older man, a man who looked like he might be around my father's age, who said, "If I had a bullet, I'd have shot myself already. I'm not a criminal. I'm not used to prison." The shame of being a prisoner loomed large, a stigma most couldn't shake. To have been shackled, handcuffed, many said, rubbing that spot on their wrists where the soft manacles were placed on them soon after they made it to the American shore. I have known no greater shame in my life. I'd met a young man from Bel Air. His eyes were red. He couldn't stop crying. His mother had died the week before, he said, and he couldn't even attend her funeral. He told me his mother's name, and when he described her house, the house where they used to live in Bel Air, I could see it. It was not far from my uncle's house. "Can I speak to my uncle?" I asked the customs officer, who was patiently waiting for me to get off the phone. "That's not allowed," he said. "Please," I said, "he's old, and he'll contact you when he gets to Crome."